Welcome to our fourth webinar, which is co-hosted by Browne, Jacobson, Moore Kingston Smith and Quilter Cheviot. I have to say we've got an exciting session before us. We're going to be exploring the future of the sector post-pandemic and the opportunities to, that catchphrase that's been used, of building back better. By way of introduction, my name is Charles Mesquita. I'm a charities director at Quilter Cheviot. I'm also a trustee of RR Glasspool, who are a grant-making charity, Bowel and Cancer Research, which is a medical research charity, and also PRISM, the Gift Fund, which is a donor advised fund. I will be moderating this session, and I am joined by my three panelists. Firstly, Caron Bradshaw, who is the Chief Executive of the Charity Finance Group. She is also Chair of the Directory of Social Change. She sits on the Church of England Pension Board Audit and Risk Committee. She has a number of multiple sort of governance roles that she plays, and was named as one of the top 30 most influential. Actually, in fact, Caron, I think I put you at the top 5, maybe in the top 3 of the most influential people in the sector. And more importantly, you're an active member of your local hockey club. We've then got Catherine Rustomji, who is a doyen of the charity legal sector. She's a partner at Browne Jacobson and a trustee of Yorkshire Cancer Research and a trustee of the Browne Jacobson Charitable Trust, which is a grant-making charity. And then last but certainly not least, we've got James Saunders, who is a doyen of the charity audit world, is a partner at Moore Kingston Smith. And one of his areas of specialism is the education sector, where he's a trustee advisor to independent schools, academies and multi-academies. At the moment, he is a trustee of a personal protection equipment charity called Med Supply Drive, also a trustee of Rose Hill School in Kent, and is a non-executive regional board director of Reach 2 Academy, which is a multi-academy trust. And finally, but not on a local basis, is actively involved with his local cricket club. So that is our three panel of experts. But before we open up to sort of the questioning about looking at the future, I thought I'd just sort of set the scene. I mean, we've seen over the last 20 years a massive transformation, both in the expansion of the charity sector, but also the professionalization. I think people tend to forget that. But it seems to be, from a public profile basis, sort of seem to have gone transformed in an unseen way, or not really hit the public radar. And that's despite actually charities being an extremely sort of vibrant cross-section of organizations doing amazing work, both from grassroots to you know, global organizations. And I have to say, I was walking my dogs this morning across the local village hall and the playing fields, and of course nowhere does it say that that is a charity, and I suspect that at least 3/4 of the village feel that's maintained by the local authority, which of course it is not, having sat as a trustee on that. But you know, we've certainly seen with the current pandemic that charities or the sector has been tested severely, but it does also feel very much a forgotten sector in the respect of people actually, I don't think, necessarily realize of how many lives that it touches, or realize that they probably realize it's be touching them, but not necessarily that it's a sector. Just to put that into perspective, and I do take time just to remind people that there are about 300,000 charities in the UK. There are about 170,000 on the Charity Commission register. And just looking at it purely on a numbers basis, the annual turnover is around about 75 billion a year, which is an enormous figure. But just to put that into perspective, that is twice what we spend on defence and half what we spend on the NHS. I think also more extraordinary is the number of trustees. There is estimated to be about 1 million in the UK, about 700,000 on the Charity Commission register. And finally, and I think probably more importantly, is that 22% of the population volunteer formally, and I'm not quite sure what formally means, according to NTVO, once a month. Well, if you just take a population of around 65 million, that's about 14 million people. So, I mean, it is an extraordinary number. But just going back to the sort of the forgotten sector, it was something that reminded me the other day, in fact, in Caron, it was one of your blogs, where the government has committed to provide emergency funding of about 750 million, but alongside that, there were headlines about Tesco's announcing a 900 million dividend, but also receiving or accepting nearly 600 million in business rate relief. And there seemed to be a slight disconnect in the help that was being provided to certain parts of society where it was not necessarily happening on other levels. Anyway, so I think that this is a very good starting point to ask the question is, Caron, if you were to pick 3 greatest opportunities for the sector post-pandemic, what would they be?
So I think I would start possibly where you've just been, which is around the role that the sector plays within society, within a, what kind of society do we want? And I think there's an opportunity flowing from this pandemic where we've had a real focus, I think, on community activity, the role that various bits of the sector have played in responding directly to the COVID crisis, but also in the peripheral things. So, it may not be specifically COVID related, but what if, for example, you are an old person who is isolated and has no community around them, how the sector has responded to those sorts of scenarios and provided befriending and support in local communities. So there's an opportunity there to reframe, I think, the role of charities and to ask those big questions about the sort of society we want to live in and where therefore we do place our money, whether or not it is right that we fund corporate entities that are distributing money to in dividends when actually you have a sector that is returning public benefit that needs some support. So that would be my first one, is that's an opportunity for us to reframe and to capitalise on that focus and spotlight. Second bit, I think, would probably be about the ability to test assumptions. So if I think about CFG, for example, there are a number of questions that I would not have possibly entertained previously, like home working. I'm not suggesting that we don't have flexible working, of course we do, but there are some roles that I would have assumed pre-pandemic were absolutely based in the office, 100%, and that I couldn't have seen a way to deliver those differently. Well, this has kind of thrown all of that into question. So this is an opportunity for organisations to really test some of the assumptions and ask those questions that we thought we probably would never have asked of ourselves previously. So I think that's another opportunity. And then I think the final one is demonstrated by how we're delivering this roundtable this morning, is digital. Things that would have taken several years or several months to evolve have had to happen sort of overnight. And that there is a real opportunity, I think, for organisations to look at how digital can be useful to them, not just from what they can deliver, but also the appetite of the people they serve to engage in a digital or virtual way. So that would be my 3.
Brilliant. And then just sort of on the flip side, the 3 greatest challenges for the sector post-pandemic.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the last one, because I think digital, whilst it's an absolute opportunity, it's also not free from risk. And there is a risk that I think that we will assume that digital by default is the right way to deliver things or the cheapest way to deliver things. And that's not necessarily going to be the case, and also requires investment. So what we can get away with perched on the end of our bed with a laptop on our knee in a crisis is not what we're going to be able to get away with once that becomes a more permanent part of our delivery mechanism. So I think digital is a risk as well that we need to think through as organisations in terms of what's right, how much it requires in terms of investment and support, and thinking actually, are we taking easy solutions or multiple solutions that aren't necessarily going to be in the best interest of our beneficiaries longer term. So that would be my first one. The second one, I think, let's say it's money and resources. And I put it like that because I don't think it is just about the huge loss of income from the sector. And I haven't spoken to many charities where they are experiencing a buoyant economic situation. I think universally most charities pretty much have had a constraint, a restriction in their income. For many, their income has collapsed overnight. And alongside that, there has been a real spike in demand for an awful lot of organisations. So you have this real squeeze on resources happening. And if you think about the adjustments that we're going to need to make in order to respond to those, we are going to be looking at fewer people delivering services, a restriction in the contraction, if you like, in the sector. And that's going to mean that we have fewer resources available to deliver and serve our beneficiaries. And that may well be at the very time that we're going into perhaps the winter pressures, potentially a second wave. The sector we know will have a second wave economically, even if there isn't a second wave of the actual virus, because we know, looking at what happened in the aftermath of the financial crash in 2008, 2009, is that 18 months or so afterwards, the money starts to dry up for the sector. There is that sort of lag in impact on the sector. So I think money and resources would be my second one. And then finally, my third one perhaps goes around this ability to test assumptions piece. And that is about looking at what are the things that have happened in the current crisis that maybe are quite useful for us going forward, trying to balance the getting through the immediate crisis with the how do we then predict what's going to be the case in 2, 3, 4 years, and how do we bridge the gap between the two, because what we need right now may not be what we need in a more permanent state once we get out of the final other side of whatever this pandemic looks like. And that period in between may be quite prolonged. You know, we're going to be dealing with some form of social distancing or restrictions in our movement, I'm pretty certain, for at least the next financial year. And so, you know, that kind of chameleon-esque need to look at both the current, but the future and the medium term all at once is going to present trustees and boards with a huge challenge and executive teams with a real headache.
Yeah, no, I think those are three very good points. James, what about you? What do you see as the sort of greatest challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, New Philanthropy Capital produced a very positive set of suggestions recently, intended for the precursor to the Kruger report, which is with the Prime Minister now, I think. Much of those suggestions, much of that was aimed at government's attitude to the sector and to infrastructure, which I think is absolutely right. They're the two big areas that provide, in fact, both the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities. I think that government support for charities needs to be more long-term, needs to be based on commitment and service delivery over the long term and value, rather than at the moment. It just seems to be, you know, so much of what the sector is expected to do is based on cost, frankly, which is, you know, completely different to, as we all know, to value. And I think that the sector is going through some major changes in its constituents as well, and the way it does things. You know, we've got social entrepreneurs, social investment, all these type of different ideas and different ways of getting money into the public voluntary sector. So the sector needs to look at itself and make sure that it's accommodating all those new ideas and all those new approaches that are proving to be very, very, very effective and quite popular in some areas at the moment. And in terms of funding, I mean, I think there needs to be a move back to understand that charities are purpose-driven organisations who aren't at their most effective in a competitive environment. And if you ask charities to compete against each other for funding or contracts, you are unlikely, in my opinion, to get the best out of those charities and out of the sector. Especially if you're asking them just to compete primarily on costs, which is, you know, a dreadful thing to see on any sort of procurement portal or tender document. You know, if 60-70% of it is cost, well, you know, where's the value discussion there? And certainly in that traditional charity realm, you know, the funding, relying on funding from central government or from big trusts or whatever, you know, it seems that over the last few years, the funding criteria have been driven by such rapidly changing intentions. You know, one year it's overseas aid is fashionable, if you like, and then it's older people's support, then it's diversity. I mean, these are all very worthy causes, but they seem to switch and change so quickly from year to year that a charity that was successful in funding in year one comes back in year three and finds that it doesn't match the criteria anymore, and it can't get that funding again. I mean, I've had this experience in my own trustee history, where, you know, a charity where I was a trustee was delivering counselling to bereaved kids, and the funding gradually diminished over 3 years, where the main source of the funding, the criteria were completely different 3 years after the initial funding, and the charity struggled thereafter. So I think that, getting back to it's the long-term commitment, much longer-term commitment from government and from funding bodies, And then, so the challenge for charities on that is to rebuild the trust to its very high level that it has been. It's dropped a bit, and it's not, it dropped from a very high level to still be very high, but that extra element, I think, of long-term funding, long-term trust in the sector has to be deserved and warranted by the sector, and we have to get ourselves back up to that level, if you like.
And I think we'll come on to some of that, I think, a little later on. Catherine, what about you?
I think greatest challenge would still be that there's such a lack of understanding about the sector itself and the crucial work that it does. I think one of the advantages of the sector is it's so disparate, it's so varied. There's a huge range of charities operating many different ways, different structures, different areas. And I think the general public doesn't understand that because it isn't made aware of it. So I think, whereas that's the challenge, I think the opportunity is for charities to get out there now and to communicate much more forcefully, more clearly, to be constantly getting their message across about the crucial work that they carry out, how they are funded, how they need ongoing support to continue to exist. And just, I think, maybe to be a bit more forthright about the impact and the benefits that they bring to society as a whole, because I think it's swept under the carpet or others take credit for their good work. And I think charities need to fight their own corner to make sure that they are treated as equals and they're appreciated for what they do.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail. In fact, I think that leads quite nicely on to my next question to you, Caron, is around this public confusion of what the welfare state delivers and the role of charity in society today. And obviously, again, because of the growth of the welfare state, that has changed. But I'm not sure that the definitions of that or the clarity of that publicly have changed. So do you think it is possible to define the role of the charity sector and be very specific about where the welfare state's responsibility stops and charity effectively takes over?
Yeah, well, I think the way I would express this, thinking about it and reflecting on that comment and the contribution that Catherine just made, is that I think the line doesn't necessarily need to be firm, but it needs to be clear. So we need to know what is being done by charities and how they are contributing. And I think there is an ability for us to, as a sector, unpack a little bit more and make it much, much clearer what the role of charities are within a well-functioning society. I mean, the way I think about it is that charity is, if you like, the glue or the filler that comes in between all the other sectors. And you're absolutely right. In your intro, you were talking about the way that we've grown. There has been this march away from the state providing, and there has been the increase, if you look at the increase of funding into the sector over the years, that has predominantly come on the back of contracts to deliver services, whether that's a spin out from a local authority or whether that's a contract to deliver something that's been put out to tender rather than being delivered by the state itself. And I'm not particularly worried about who delivers to meet the need of the public, but rather that the need of the public is met. And I think some of the problems come in not understanding the role that charities play, but most of the problems actually come from wanting to do things, as James was saying, cheaper, and thinking that is efficiency and effectiveness, and that these terms are interchangeable. They're not. You can be efficient without being particularly effective. So I think we do need to ask ourselves some questions about the sort of society we want to live in and the role that we think charities should play in that. And we do need to highlight the role that charities play. You know, you may not know that if you crash a car and the air ambulance comes, that it is actually a charity that's doing it, and that it's not part of the NHS. Or you may not realise that you know, your school is a charitable organisation, or your village hall, or your playing field. So knowing the role that charities play, and that being clear as opposed to a firm line, I think is a more important piece. And we should definitely, I think, invest in describing who we are, because if you ask the average person to describe charity, what they'll probably talk about is something that's small, low-key, amateur. But you ask them to name a charity and they'll name a household brand that is completely the opposite of that.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I think the hospice movement is a very good example of that confusion, where, you know, I think if you ask the general public how much of the funding comes from government, people wouldn't have a clue of whether it's 15 to 40% or whatever it may be. But actually, if it didn't exist, who would have to provide? And do we feel that government would be able to provide it in any way of the quality of the hospice movement has managed to do? I think the answer simply is no. So I think that is definitely... Catherine, the regulator has very much changed, the Charity Commission has changed the way that it regulates the sector over the last 10 to 15 years. Do you think that they have a role to play in helping the public understand what charities are there for and the benefits to society? And do you think they are actually doing that?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the Charity Commission, they have a range of functions, duties and objectives. I think in response to that question, Charles, I think the main area I would focus on is the objective to increase public trust and confidence in charities, but also to promote awareness and understanding of the operation of the public benefit principle. And I think for both of those, I think where you have a strong regulator that's able to maintain and to enforce the relevant standards, whilst giving confidence generally to those with an interest in the sector, then I think those objectives are achieved. I mean, where I would praise the Charity Commission would be particularly during the pandemic. The advice and guidance that they've regularly produced and updated has been really useful for charity trustees to be able to access that. But where I would query whether the Commission is fulfilling its objectives would be when it reacts to negative press stories about charities and publicly criticises them for getting things wrong, rather than praising the vast majority of charities that are getting things right. And I know some of my clients, trustees would describe, I suppose, operating through more a culture of fear, that they're almost waiting to be criticised by the Charity Commission for getting something wrong. Even if it was well-meaning and well-intentioned, it could still be a mistake in some way. And I think this public criticism, this shaming of charities, I think overall is harmful to the sector. I don't think that that increases public trust and confidence. And I'm not necessarily convinced that it raises standards either. And I think when you look at 1 million trustees, do they feel that they are helped by the Charity Commission, appreciated, praised, encouraged? Probably none of those adjectives, I think, would be used in how the Charity Commission behave. And I think there is that question about standards. So what standard is the charity sector measured against, and who is the arbiter of that and who enforces that, I think is a much bigger piece to look at.
And I think that's particularly prevalent, isn't it, for the number of people who volunteer, whether it's trustees or just actually working within charities, and how important it is actually to say thank you for their contribution. James, one of the areas that that has been picked up by the Charity Commission and around the sort of public trust and confidence is that charities should be held to a higher standard. Do you think they should be held to a higher standard than either the public sector or even the private sector?
I think probably my initial thought would be that all entities should be held to the very highest ethical professional standards in terms of how they go about their work. But equally, I think if the charity sector wants to rebuild that trust to that very high level that it has had in the past, really extend that trust and really build on it, I think it's probably got to hold itself to those extremely high standards. Because of course we are at heart talking about public money that charities are using by and large. So I think there's got to be a recognition that there will always be that expectation of a higher standard. So if that's what you've got to meet, then you ought to try and strive to get there. Should it be held to a higher standard? Well, it is. And it needs to be because of the public money side of things, I think. Yes.
Caron, do you want to come to that, or?
So where I would absolutely agree with James is that I think that all of society actually needs to be held to a high ethical standard. It's not okay to allow exploitation to occur just because you happen to be selling double glazing or solar panels, So I think we shouldn't be saying that exploitation is okay, and absolutely charities should be striving for the highest standards, not just because they're receiving public money, but because of who we are and what we're doing. we're there to make the world a better place. So we shouldn't be fleecing our beneficiaries or exploiting people. That, you know, that just doesn't feel like it's consistent with why we exist and what we're there to do. But where I think I would probably emphasize a concern is around this sort of almost obsession with the word trust. You know, I've said in the past that my analogy is that if you ask a woman in labour how's she doing with pain, and you constantly ask her about pain, the thing that's the forefront of her mind is pain. The same with the Charity Commission. If we're constantly asking people whether they trust, is that the thing that's going to be at the forefront of their mind? And I think where I would criticise the Commission, and it isn't just about the current chair, but I think it's more pronounced under the current chair, is this constant asking of what does the public expect. And I think that the public expectation is not the same as delivering public benefit or acting in the public interest. And the public expectation, we know from, you know, some of the media stories that run, can be a flexible and fragile thing, and it can be a fickle thing. And responding and meeting that expectation isn't necessarily acting in the public interest or likely to generate trust. You know, in actual fact, it could be completely doing the opposite and undermining trust. So I think Catherine is absolutely right. The Charity Commission has been fantastic in many regards during this pandemic. If you take the serious incident reporting guidance is a good example, where they've really collaborated with the sector and they've talked to the professional infrastructure bodies about how we can best support and guide charities. It got off to a bit of a false start, but once they collaborated and encouraged conversation and dialogue, what came out was a much more improved and useful and helpful document. But I think the staff of the Charity Commission are by and large excellent and have absolutely the desire to support the sector in being its very best. But I do agree with Catherine, if you have this sort of climate of fear and preoccupation with the levels of trust, as opposed to being driven and guided by public benefit and public interest, you will not necessarily see trust increase, and you won't necessarily increase understanding of the sector and how it operates and the functions that it can undertake.
Yeah, and being the regulator, of course, the public will look to the regulator and accept whatever they say as gospel. And it's actually, I think it's quite interesting looking at the way that the Charity Commission uses its biannual review of charities versus Oscar, which puts the Scottish regulator, which puts out a very different spin on the information that comes back. I just want to pick up, Caron, with you on an issue that James talked about earlier around funding from government, because, you know, it wasn't that long ago where Kids Company, one of the findings from the Select Committee reports was a criticism, or that they recommended that the government should review the way that the charities are funded. And in fact, of the other findings that came out of the report, the charity sector should be applauded for the way that it reacted and how quickly it addressed those issues. But the two issues that were never addressed was government funding and the way that ministers had behaved. We'll put the ministers to one side and we'll look at government funding. So the question I really wanted to ask you is, do you think government funding, the issue around that could be resolved, this move from grants to commissioning? Or do you actually think that the sector would be better off accepting no government funding and going completely independent, so that it can go to the public and say, actually, everything we do is done that's funded purely from the generosity of the general public?
So I think that's a very complicated question, and I'm not sure there's a simple answer. I don't necessarily think receiving money from the government automatically means that you are not independent. And in fact, you know, legally, and Catherine might want to come in here, legally you have to be independent. You can't the piper cannot pay the price and call the tune. You know, that's not supposed to happen. The perception, of course, is something very different, and I think being beholden to government may well be, you know, difficult. Therefore, to be able to act in the best interests of your beneficiaries, if you are frightened about biting the hand that feeds. So there's definitely all of that perception issue. But ironically, when you think about how the charities that have survived and thrived during this pandemic, the ones that have been most resilient are probably the ones that are being in receipt of contracts from government that have held up or have been funded by a single grant funder that has been able to stand behind them. The ones that have been less resilient have actually been the ones that have been following what we've said is a healthy approach to income management and the diversification of your funding portfolio. Those are the ones that have actually found it really, really tough, because every area of their financial model has been under stress as a result of this pandemic, because none of us, I guess, could have predicted such a widespread social and economic impact from the current environment. So I think it's a really difficult funding mix for an environment for the sector. And the irony is that the government actually has been able to stand behind an awful lot more of those charities who would have failed or would have been under greater pressure had they been entirely reliant on donations and funding. Second thing I would say that we perhaps haven't thought about is around that sort of fundraising piece. So the appetite of the public to receive a knock at the door, a piece of mail through the door, a telephone call, all of those things are necessary parts of raising money from the public. And if those things are constantly criticised and closed down, if you don't ask, you don't get. So, we have to think very carefully about how we support the sector, and also the expectations that we put on it, or the restrictions that we put on it, and the criticism we give it for going about trying to generate income to support what is actually, at the end of the day, delivery of public benefit in the public interest.
Yeah. And I think that neatly leads on to an area where I think the sector has suffered. I'm not sure there's going to be an easy answer to this one either, is around not having a strong advocate. Do you, Caron, think that there can be a single voice for the sector? And if so, who should that be?
It's been a long-held debate, hasn't it, whether or not the sector requires a CBI, or the other alternative is the question that's the comparison with the US, with the US American Charities Defence League. I'm less worried about there being a single voice, and actually I think be careful what you wish for, because a single voice, we've already heard about this hugely diverse sector. When we talk about the sector, it isn't a single set of organisations all acting and reacting in the same way, and therefore having a single voice to represent that sector may not actually be as sensible as it might sound in terms of being attractive. So I'm more concerned about the sector being uncomfortable with there being a variety of different voices, and I'm more worried about the sector being able to speak with a consistent voice. So at the base level, our motives are the same. We want to change the world for it to be a better place. Our methods absolutely will differ depending on our beneficiaries, our business models, our different constitution. So as long as that motive is consistent and we are able to articulate that to our supporters, our beneficiaries, the general public, I'm less worried about there being a single voice. I'm more worried about us having division, and that division being used to divide and conquer us. And so I think thinking about something like the Never More Needed campaign, where we have a coalition of voices that are coming together, and we're looking at what brings us together rather than what divides us. What are the common purposes that we have? And being able to say with a sort of the single motive why we exist as a sector, I think is more important than necessarily creating a single body with a single voice. Yeah, I think that's where I would go with that one.
So on that basis, I mean, do you think there are some sort of consistent, simple messages that all charities could be giving out?
I think that there are consistent messages that charities could be giving out, and I think it absolutely goes to what Catherine was saying earlier about absolutely banging their drum, celebrating what it is that they're there to do, who their beneficiaries are, and communicating with those stakeholders and being able to say, this is the difference we make. And that, I think, is the important thing, is actually celebrating and amplifying, because if you don't know what's out there, how can you support it? If you don't know what other organisations exist, how can you come together and collaborate to amplify the impact on the beneficiaries.
Goes back to my village hall and nobody reminding anybody that it's a charity.
Exactly.
Catherine, you have a view on this?
Yeah, I think more voices is better. I just think we should have voices. I think we're too British, too polite, couldn't possibly say anything. We'll wait for someone else to say it for us. And I think what was fascinating was the comparison when arts organisations, theatres, arts venues across the country really motivated and, had a number of, whether they were patrons, ambassadors, supporters that were speaking on their behalf, and the groundswell of attention that brought to a sector that I think could have been overlooked. And I think sometimes government does that because it can. So it assumes that subsector is not important to people, and that's where they go wrong. But they're getting that wrong impression because people don't make them aware of just how valued that subsector is. So I think, rather than one voice that might not be covering all of these angles, I think charities should be more vocal now and should, be clearer about, what's wrong, what can be better, how they can help, where their part fits within this jigsaw. But I would definitely agree with Caron. I think one voice, I think we'd probably feel it wasn't accurate, but I think many voices, I think, has much more power.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And just the last area I wanted just to focus on is that the pandemic has been an incredible catalyst of bringing organisations together, working in collaboration and partnership. And we've seen an amazing amount of innovation coming because of people's forced circumstances. Now, just casting yourself forward, we're back to some sort of normality, however long that takes. Do you think that we will see more collaboration, more partnership, more mergers going on within the sector to have a greater, and if so, how do you think that might sort of transpire or change?
So it's interesting that collaboration and merger are almost used in the same breath there, because for me, mergers aren't necessarily the immediate and obvious consequence of needing to come together. And in fact, we often see mergers happening as a response to financial distress, and frankly, that's the worst time to merge. It should be because of strategic imperative and what can come out to amplify for the beneficiaries. And often mergers don't save money; they cost money, and they can be they can be quite difficult. But I think certainly this situation has created a burning platform that has meant that organisations have had to think, how do we get the most out of our resources? And they've had to come together much more. There's been I've never seen the level of collaboration that's currently underway. And I would hope that does continue. And certainly there seems to be an appetite for it to continue. But collaboration is bloody difficult. It's messy and hard. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the, once the burning platform is less on fire, how it needs the energy behind it to keep it going, and we shouldn't underestimate how much energy it does take to collaborate. But we absolutely should, I think, use our passion, resources, enthusiasm to come together to make the most out of it, because we know from the reports and information that we've taken that we're looking at circa 12 billion less income, less resource into the sector, and that doesn't just mean less money into the sector. That means fewer counsellors being able to answer calls, or smaller numbers of provision of services. It's fewer people to deliver the things that we do. It's not just a smaller sector; it's a smaller delivery, and therefore coming together and collaborating is one of the ways in which we can potentially make the most out of the resources that we've got, if you like, to create the most bang for our buck, to use a sort of metaphor.
And James, there's an issue, isn't there, around VAT and sort of collaboration and partnership? There
can be, yes. But the VAT stuff gets so complicated that it's understandable that those sort of considerations often do get in the way of sensible discussion about getting back to collaboration versus merger, if you like. I mean, we see collaboration going on all the time. The Heritage Lottery Fund does loads and loads of multi-charity grants where project-based, where they give a large amount of money to a number of providers in one lump and say go away. Now that's collaboration at its best, because they're all working towards a single project, all doing things in their different areas. These charities, I think it's a great example of how collaboration does work and can work very well at the moment. Mergers, on the other hand, I mean the Eastside Primetimers survey that comes out every year, it's 60 or 70 mergers in a year. I mean, it's a tiny amount, really. And I think that, personally, I think that comes from, Karen's right. It's strategy, it's culture, it's everything to do with this, the whole holistic side of an entity. When you look at mergers, it's not just looking at finances. And indeed, I think probably a lot of mergers are unsuccessful because people do just look at the finances or the purpose and say, we do the same thing, therefore let's come together, rather than say, are all our purposes aligned, our entire organisations are aligned. I mean, Charles, from your own experience, how many more elements are there to organisations than just the original purpose or just the finances that seem to work well together? So I think that is the big question with mergers, and I don't think there's going to be much more improvement in mergers without there being an understanding that you need to have that complete, a very close synergy to get the most out of a merger, and we see a lot more examples of that, rather than seeing of those 60 or 70 in a year. I wonder how many are actually seen to be successful. I'd say perhaps half of them, maybe.
Well, I have to say, going through it at the moment, it's been a fascinating experience, but it is time consuming, it is complex, and it is expensive. And you start the process thinking, I'm putting two and two together, and we were doing it strategically, not from one organization being in a financial problem, but are you going to make 5 or 6 by doing it rather than making 2 or 3? And there's a risk thing, and so there's a belief going on in it. So I have to say that having been through or going through the process, to my mind, working in partnership and collaboration does make a lot of sense, and I encourage organisations and to think slightly differently as well. It's not necessarily looking at organisations doing something similar, it's looking for organisations that may be doing something completely different, but just complementing what you're doing.
There are barriers though, Charles. You talked about VAT there. There are barriers to charities collaborating. So we've long said about VAT on shared services. If you were able to say that if you're operating in a not-for-profit space, you can deliver with other organisations, say a HR function or a finance function, or whatever. I hate the phrase back office, but those support functions that enable organisations to deliver front-end services. The government could quite easily, with the strike of a pen, take away VAT on shared services for charities, and that would create an additional 20% of saving potentially for charities that don't currently do it, and therefore there is no loss to the exchequer. There are barriers that could be removed for charities. No,
I think, and that simple things like that make so much sense for doing it. Now, I'm just conscious of time. I think I'm going to ask each of you one question, the same question, and maybe I'll start with Catherine. It's just about what do you think is the single biggest, if you were to give one message to trustees, what would that be about what they might want to focus on post-pandemic?
I would recommend, I suppose, communicate, I think network and collaborate. And I think the missing point, I've already mentioned communication a number of times, but networking, I think, for trustees to build their own networks. Have they got contacts with other charities, with other organisations in different sectors? Can they move around a bit more fluidly with the contacts that they know and start having conversations with others that they haven't dealt with before? So I think being more imaginative about how that collaboration could take place and what the structure of that could be. But an ongoing discussion, I think, in terms of what they need to do and who they need to be talking with.
Brilliant. James, what about you?
Yeah, well, with an accountant's hat on, I think it's pretty clear that there are some huge financial challenges down the road in 21 and 22. The sector's been doing more with less for, well, however many years. But this is only going to get more pronounced. We've seen the forecasts from, organisations like Browne Economics and the National Emergencies Trust showing that there is an increase in service demand while funding, so that gap is, and that paradox is increasing. But in line with Catherine's point, the imagination, the imaginative work that's going on in the sector during COVID-19 and even before that, it's really a really interesting time to see organisations doing things differently and coming at problems differently and sourcing funds differently. Much closer relationship with private money in those spheres. The new KICs and social enterprises that are doing things in a different way to traditional charities. I think that's something we all need to be aware of, because the whole sector space is changing. Not dramatically overnight, but there is a groundswell coming through of people who want to do things slightly differently, I think, and they have money to spend and to invest, but it's slightly different to traditional charity giving. I think they want to be involved, they want to see results, they want to see impact, and impact reporting, is going to be so much more important in the future. So I think keeping an eye on all of those elements as they change, even through a very challenging funding a problem at the moment. I think that's well worth knowing at the moment.
Brilliant, excellent. And Caron, last word?
Yeah, so I would use the analogy of bees to the environment. I think that charities are to society what bees are to the environment. You don't see them, they operate underneath the radar. They are the thing that kind of keeps things motoring. They're the oil in the wheels and all of those sorts of metaphors that you could use. So my message to trustees is you are never more needed, not just individually, but collectively. So buzz about it, talk about it, create that noise, because as Catherine said, one voice might only be overlooked. Many voices should create volume that can't be ignored.
Brilliant. I think that's a wonderful analogy of the bees and how we take them for granted, but if they're not there, woe betide us from a society, how much poorer we would be as a result of it. Well, I'd just like to thank my three panelists: Caron Bradshaw, Chief Executive of the Charity Finance Group, Catherine Rustomji, Charity Partner at Browne Jacobson, and James Saunders, Charity Partner at Moore Kingston Smith, just for their contribution. I think it's been a really excellent debate, and I think for me the big takeaway is that we just need to be stronger in the way that we communicate and make sure that people, and don't just assume that people know, and actually just keep reminding them of the amazing work that the sector does at every level. I hope everybody's enjoyed this webinar. We've got a number of other webinars planned. So we're going to be looking at fundraising and whether you can build a sustainable future for an organisation. We're going to look at the review of the governance code, which they've classified as a refresh. And then we'll also come on to looking at where there are opportunities through technology. So thank you very much, all of you, and we will end it there.